On September of last year, Health Secretary RFK Jr. said this.
Overall, the autism is increasing in prevalence at an alarming rate. This is a preventable disease. This is an individual tragedy as well. Autism destroys families. More importantly, it destroys our greatest resource, which are our children.
I'm autistic, but I'm not going to lie that when I first heard that RFK Jr. was planning on tackling the soaring autism rates, I wasn't all that surprised. Amongst the wave of violent deportations, genocide, and imperialism, all backed by AI-generated slop on Twitter, misinformation about my disability is nothing shocking, especially coming from this guy.
To particular antigens that blacks have a much stronger reaction. There's differences in reaction to different products by different races.
We're living in the age of anti-intellectualism. His 30-minute speech, or whatever you want to call it, was still fascinating, but not for the reasons you may think. RFK Jr. goes on about how rates of autism are soaring, destroying families and draining our economy, all because of Tylenol usage during pregnancy? Yes, his conclusions were alarming, but what's even more concerning is the research that he used to back up his claim. In the big 2026, why are universities still producing and profiting from eugenicist research? It's not like these studies are being conducted by academic nobodies or quacks on the internet. They are being conducted by elite researchers affiliated with the Ivy Leagues. For example, Dr. Beccarelli, dean of Harvard's Public Health School, conducted the study that linked neurodevelopmental disorders to Tylenol usage during pregnancy. The thing is, using pseudoscience to justify political projects is nothing new. I can draw the obvious parallel of Nazi Germany's use of eugenics to euthanize the disabled, but we don't have to look across the globe to draw historic parallels. Aside from the fact that the Nazis were literally inspired by American chattel slavery, institutional eugenics really took off because of researchers from here, in the United States. It's a disservice to go to Europe because, really, a lot of fascistic elements were homegrown. As this video will show, the current autism panic provoked by RFK Jr. is nothing new. It is the continuation of 19th and 20th century ideas of population control, racial purity, and national health. While the language has changed,
genes do not cause epidemics. They can provide a vulnerability. You need an environmental toxin.
The eugenic goal remains.
We are doing this to our children, and we need to put an end to it.
It is only now, when capitalism is in decay, when the state and its institutional allies are shedding their progressive packaging. But where did this all come from? And why does the state keep returning to eugenic thought? Let's learn together. This video was brought to you by my wonderful patrons over on patreon.com/MegaLaFay. If you would like to support my channel further, please head to that link. I am a student and a worker, and it takes a lot of time and resources to film these videos. So if you could help, I would love if you could check that out. But if that's not in your means, feel free to just subscribe to my channel and share the video. It does a massive service to my channel, and hopefully one day I'll be able to dedicate all of my time to making videos. As always, thank you for your patience, and I really hope you guys enjoy this video. While the eugenics program is most commonly associated with the Nazis in Germany, this pseudoscience gained institutional prominence on American soil. In the early 1900s, a 17-year-old girl named Carrie Buck was sent to Virginia State Colony for epileptics and the feeble-minded, and was ordered to be sterilized by a Dr. Albert Priddy. Her crime? Having low intelligence and getting pregnant before marriage. In 1924, Buck took Dr. Priddy to court for violating her autonomy. Unfortunately, Buck lost her case, And Virginia state law continued to allow doctors like Pretty to sterilize those who they saw as unfit, even against their will. After appealing her case, it eventually rose up to the Supreme Court. But Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes struck it down, stating that, quote, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from breeding their kind." While you may be shocked by the pure venom of his words, this was a common view that doctors, government officials, and politicians shared about disabled people. But it wasn't always like this. Humans have a rich history of showing empathy and support for disabled individuals. So how did it get this way? Let's go a few years back in American history. After the colonists declared independence from Great Britain, America shifted from a mercantilist economy to a capitalist one. They embarked on a nation-building project, writing laws, expanding borders, and creating a national in-group. Who gets rights and who doesn't? Who gets the power to make change in society? Who does the state seek to represent? These are all questions that they used to establish the American in-group, the citizenry. Following the horrors of indigenous genocide and chattel slavery, an out-group was successfully established. However, continuous resistance from these groups threatened to establish the existing social order. They threatened to contaminate the in-group of white property-owning men. So symbolic concessions were made to the out-group whenever they threatened to disrupt the existing hierarchy. In the 19th century, indigenous reservations were opened, and sharecropping and imported migrant labor replaced chattel slavery to extract profits at a minimal cost. But these groups, alongside the influence of new migrant laborers, kept fighting against their exploitative conditions. New narratives were necessary in justifying the social, economic, and political inequalities faced by people of color. In 1913, climatologist Robert de Courcy Ward wrote that, in America, quote, "It is becoming clear that the day of the sociologist is passing, and the day of the biologist has come." In the 20th century, the American ruling class sought to reaffirm these social hierarchies through a scientific, evolutionary lens. They borrowed these ideas from the English, the pioneers of social progress, civilization, and masters of justifying colonial atrocities. You see, the British Empire needed to legitimize, well, their empire, and the moral authority of science was able to do so, sanctioning imperial conquest under the guise of progress or development. Eugenics was a concept developed by Sir Francis Galton, who in the 1880s expanded upon his cousin's research. You may have heard of him. Does Charles Darwin ring a bell? Anyways, he believed that natural selection also applied to different races of human beings. Of course, he was wrong in this assumption. The reason that certain demographics are impoverished and others aren't are because of their material conditions. In other words, if you have access to resources, you are more likely to survive. If your resources are being plundered, you're less likely to survive. According to the National Institutes of Health, quote, "Eugenics is broadly defined as the use of selective breeding to improve the human race." In other words, eugenics was a proposed tool of speeding up the process of natural selection. According to Professor of Psychology Oksana Yakushoko, eugenicists used empirical analysis, statistics, and other scientific tools to, quote, "identify which cultures and individuals displayed the highest and lowest levels of evolutionary development, and what kind of individuals were optimal for procreating subsequent fit generations." This applied not only to the colonial subjects that they sought to dominate, but also to problematic minorities back at home. According to the autism researcher Bonnie Evans, eugenics was also used domestically to increase national efficiency and the interests of the bourgeois. In other words, social Darwinism and eugenics was used to justify the existing social order. By attributing social situations to biological inheritance and survival of the fittest, social stratification became a biological matter. Solidarity amongst different minority groups was discouraged. because there wasn't a common oppressor, just good and bad genetics. This discourse eventually found its way into American scientific circles, which began to use the language of disease, hygiene, and inheritance to describe minority populations. Social issues were reframed as inheritable traits that sustained itself in certain groups. The poverty of African Americans post-slavery was explained by the inferiority of their blood. The exclusion of Chinese immigrants was justified because they were procreating with white women and polluting white blood. Racialized eugenics and social Darwinism had entered mainstream discourses, allowing for the formal exclusion of other quote-unquote unproductive or contaminated bodies. In 1935, Ellsworth Huntington stated it would by no means be a misnomer to call the American Eugenics Society a society for the control of social cancer. Just a disclaimer, I will be using the words madness, feeble-minded, etc. to describe cognitively disabled and mentally ill individuals. Obviously, it's outdated, but this is the language that people used in the past. Up until the late Renaissance, the Western world did not view madness as mental illness necessarily. Thus, it was never treated as a condition to be cured. However, following the scientific revolution, people began to measure the health of the mind. This is largely due to the positivist movement. Positivism was a school of thought that emerged in 19th century Europe. It is the belief that all knowledge should be derived from our observable, immediate sensory experiences, instead of abstract philosophical debate. These thinkers hailed the scientific method and empirical evidence, claiming that it could be used to describe almost anything, even broad issues like race, gender, and class. To the positivists, science was a neutral authority that separated fact from fiction. Unlike metaphysics, which deals with abstract concepts like God, morality, and the nature of being, positivists used reason and logic to make sense of the world. However, their reasons and logic were based on metaphysical ideas. Eugenics was based on the idea that there exists an ideal or perfected human form, which is a principle that cannot be scientifically substantiated. Understanding disorders of the mind before brain scans and imaging software was nearly impossible. Even with modern technology, neuroscientists and philosophers still disagree on how to understand the human brain. However, following the scientific revolution, doctors came up with vague bodily processes to explain differences in behavior. Manic depressives were individuals with tense nerve fibers, and hysterics were women with shifting wombs. These were corrupted bodies in need of purification. They were disrupting the social order, so they needed to be confined. This shift in attitude and treatment reflected a social change. Namely, it reflected the interests of ruling regimes in containing madness. Categorizing people into mentally ill and healthy helped to establish a regime of normalcy, a social in-group. Eugenics was born out of this shift. The health of the mind became an integral component of biological fitness. According to Dr. Yakshoko, American psychologists played a central role in defining the eugenic ideal of a, quote, healthy human being. In the early 1900s, psychology was a newer discipline, and academics from this field desperately wanted to fit in with the rest of the scientific community. First, they distanced themselves from Freud and the psychoanalysts, whom they viewed as speculative and unscientific. Second, they adopted trends in the Western scientific community, which at the time was evolutionary science and eugenics. Using funds from the military, elite psychologists were able to align themselves with the state, which had a vested interest in naturalizing social inequality. They conducted intelligence tests on U.S. soldiers that established the, quote, inferior levels of intelligence among African Americans, recent non-Nordic immigrants, and Jews. But hey, at least they weren't psychoanalysts with mommy issues, right? Right? The issue is you can't just cite some statistics and call it a day. That's literally weaponized sloth. Using numbers and statistics is helpful for getting an understanding of the current situation, but it doesn't brush the surface of the complex historical circumstances that brought about these numbers in the first place. But it was easy, and psychologists were able to climb the ladder of institutional legitimacy, and they got their cushy tenure jobs. But at what cost? Tellingly, the psychologists who conducted these studies weren't quack scientists. They were Ivy League academics coming from Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, Columbia, and more. Similar to how RFK used institutionally backed research to legitimize his claim, institutionally backed psychologists were some of the main proponents of America's eugenic program. U.S. psychologists successfully helped propagate a moral panic of mental degeneration in American society. Most notably, eugenicist Dr. Henry H. Goddard linked cognitive disabilities to social maladjustment and criminal behavior. He called these individuals feeble-minded or moronic. According to Gerald O'Brien, quote, these persons, and especially higher-functioning morons, were believed to be the nucleus from which a wide range of social evils, including poverty, drunkenness, sexually transmitted diseases, and a range of other disability conditions, emanated. As we can see, feeble-mindedness was an umbrella term used to describe a wide range of differently functioning individuals that he considered to have lower levels of intelligence. This included people with learning disabilities, dementia, autism spectrum disorder, and impoverished folk who didn't have the resources to be able to access education. Along with other medical practitioners and politicians, psychologists began to speak of the feeble-minded as a widespread issue in need of control. In 1912, Dr. Walter E. Fernald addressed the Massachusetts Medical Society, calling for the medical community to recognize a crisis in the presence of feeble-mindedness in America. This speech was eerily similar to RFK's autism speech. I don't even think it needs that much explaining. Just listen to these parallels. First, both of them begin their argument by establishing a crisis. Dr. Walter begins by saying, quote, the past few years have witnessed a striking awakening of professional and popular consciousness of the widespread prevalence of feeble-mindedness. RFK begins by saying,
overall, the autism is increasing in prevalence at an alarming rate.
They then use statistics and empirical evidence to back up this claim, and assert that this is a widespread issue happening across the country. Dr. Walter states, quote, there are probably 2 in 1,000 of our population, scarcely a village or a school district, where one or more will not be found. And RFK states,
the ASD prevalence rate in 8-year-olds is now 1 in 31. Shocking. Overall, the risk for boys of getting an autism diagnosis in this country is now 1 in 20.
They then go on to assess the impact of these numbers. Specifically, they argue that the existence of these individuals is a burden to our economy and resources. Dr. Walter states, quote, the feeble-minded are parasitic, predatory class, a menace and danger to the community. And RFK states,
there's a recent study by Blaxell et al. And a team of other researchers that said that the cost of treating autism in this country by 2035, so within 10 years, will be $1 trillion a year. And this is catastrophic for our country.
They both also point towards the negative impact that disabled people had on families. Dr. Walter stating that, quote, they cause inutterable sorrow at home. And RFK saying that,
more importantly, it destroys our greatest resource, which are our children.
He goes on to say that, quote, many will never hold a job, pay taxes, or live independently. Both of them characterize disabled people as parasitic because of their reliance on community support. Both of them characterize us as dangerous because we defy social norms and expectations. I will admit that the Dr. Walter speech was very difficult to read, but it is important to understand the huge role that medical institutions had in perpetuating these eugenicist narratives. Dr. Fernald concludes his speech by proposing that, quote, "In light of our present knowledge, the only way to reduce the number of the feeble-minded is to prevent their birth. The perpetuation of defective family stocks should be inhibited," which was a very similar conclusion to RFK's autism speech. In the 19th and 20th centuries, doctors conducted involuntary sterilizations on the mentally handicapped. As early as 1907, Governor J. Frank Hanley made it mandatory the state of Indiana to sterilize certain incarcerated individuals, inspiring other states to follow suit. By 1927, the Supreme Court's landmark Buck v. Bell decision allowed these states to forcibly sterilize those who they deemed to be unfit for society. More than 60,000 disabled, socially deviant, and marginalized people in America were involuntarily sterilized because of this decision. As you can see, America's history of persecuting the disabled is long, dark, and continuous. This is because we live in an age of biopolitical authority. French philosopher Michel Foucault argued that in the Western world, modern structures of power no longer only exercise control through death, but through the management of life itself. Previously, ruling classes legitimized their rule through death. For example, kings and warlords crushed their rivals on the battlefield and physically tortured subjects who undermined their authority. These were public, bloody spectacles that demonstrated the disproportionate power of the state and their monopolization of violence. The common people, the serfs, the peasantry who starved, lacked the means and/or strategy to resist. In 16th century Europe, mercantilism replaced the feudal economic base. This was a system that relied on trade and markets. Enlightenment theories of individualism and liberty began to emerge. According to Foucault, quote, "We saw the emergence of techniques of power that were essentially centered on the body, on the individual body." After the Industrial Revolution and transition into a capitalist economic base, the control of human bodies became integral to the functioning of society. Early factories required able-bodied workers, and profit-driven capitalists needed them to work long hours for little pay. Workers had to be monitored and trained. In order to survive, the proletariat had to surrender their bodies to the bourgeois. Now, not only did the ruling class control death, they controlled life itself. Foucault argues that different branches of the system managed different aspects of life. The government controlled the movement of people within borders. Hospitals collected data on sick bodies and monopolized access to life-saving information and medicine. The ruling classes monopolized access to technology and science to keep people dependent and subservient on these systems. To live a good life, you had to work within these systems. This is what Foucault refers to as biopolitics. Controlling the health of populations, managing fertility, disease, and gathering information on individual bodies. These statistics are taken and categorized into normal and abnormal in accordance to what society sees as fit. However, the body, or bios, doesn't just refer to the individuals that make up a community. It is also the metaphorical social body of the state. This social body is at constant risk of contamination by the outgroup, the migrant, the trans person, the disabled person, etc. The nation-state then emerges as a body in need of protection. The neutral language of science and public health are used to justify their exclusion from society.
Dans cette mesure-là, la psychologie apparaîtrait comme purement et simplement la reprise scientifique de ce qui, jusqu'à présent, avait été aliéné et obscur à soi-même sous la forme de la philosophie.
While his analysis on biopolitics is great, one of my problems with Foucault is that he rejects dialectical materialism. In other words, he doesn't nearly consider the impact that the economic base has on the functioning of every system. Instead, he focuses on epistemology, the study of knowledge and beliefs. But cultural aspects of society, such as epistemology, are inseparable from the economic mode of production. In reality, biopolitics is a result of a profit-driven economy. Capitalism treats human beings as capital and requires the subjugation of their bodies. Positivism, social Darwinism, and eugenics rose alongside the growth of industrialized capitalism and imperialism. It's easy to disavow our eugenic history as a pseudoscience of the past, as a malicious ad hoc justification for oppression that Americans must contend with and look back on with scorn. But eugenics never really left dominant medical discourses. We're living in the age of eugenic modernity. While terms like eugenics and social Darwinism are no longer accepted in respected scientific communities, the same underlying principles still exist. This is because our capitalist economic mode of production has not changed. According to Will from the blog Revolting Bodies, quote, "The physician takes on another role. No longer simply now the doctor must be practitioner, judge, and social manager, they are now an economist. Under capitalist hegemony, workers' bodies are treated as human capital, as machines that can be optimized for production. Production is measured in numbers, in profits, losses, time, etc. Bodies are reduced to variables, and disabled bodies are risky ones. RFK's crackdown on autism did not appear out of the blue. It is a continuation of eugenic narratives. The only reason that we are surprised is because his language is outdated. It is reminiscent of a past that we're supposed to look back on with shame. However, dominant narratives and practices still perpetuate eugenic narratives. Disabled people like myself have to fight tooth and nail for basic accommodations, support, and care. We are incompatible with the machine. Through RFK's unfiltered language and radical right-wing politics, the state's continuation of their eugenic project is unveiled. The way that he talks about autism as a disease that destroys individuals, families, and communities bears close resemblance to the fear of feeble-mindedness in early 20th century America. This is because excluding the disabled from society was integral to the nation-building project. Being on the margins of society is excruciating, but it offers you a unique perspective, a clarity of sorts, that the in-group doesn't have. You see, despite facing poverty and exploitative conditions, white able-bodied workers in America are told that they're special. The problems that they face are because of people like us, on the margins, people of color, disabled folk, trans folk, etc. They eat up breadcrumbs offered by the state, but at the end of the day, that's all they are, breadcrumbs. The fascist state does not feed the bellies of white Americans, it feeds their fragile egos. Instead of trying to assimilate with the hegemon, I encourage all of us on the margins of society to embrace our perspectives and use it to connect with each other. The system wants to normalize you, but don't let it, because your abnormality is dangerous to them. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. As always, my videos are brought to you by my lovely patrons on patreon.com/MikaLefay. A special thank you to Mojo Ministry, Matt, Pete, Cokestraw, Thomas, Goop Pilote, David Ryan, Pikio Banana, Alex Beneshek, Chase Reynolds, Aaron, Girlfriend Hagel 3087, Louis DeMazzo, The Frilled Shark, Stray, Paul McCown, Yori, Kruger Kitty, Friedemann Salmer, GZW, Nicholas Rossett, Alpertuis, Joseph Ross, Randy White, Quantic Potato, Adriana, Stephen W., H3 Willette, Jonah2978, That Was Not Chicken, Pokerino, Coley, Emperor Midokai Scenarius III Esque, Cayman Rogers, Pontastato, N30 Gnosis, and David Larkin. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye!